Hello, my name is Kelsey Ralph, and my goal today is to convince you not to worry about distracted pedestrians. To be clear, people certainly do walk distracted. Based on observations of thousands of pedestrians at multiple intersections, we know that somewhere between 12 and 45% of pedestrians are distracted. What distracts them? I've listed results from a study in Seattle, but the pattern tends to be similar elsewhere. People are most likely to walk using headphones, are less likely to be looking at a screen, and even less likely to be holding a phone up to their ear. Does distraction change behavior? We have evidence from observations in real-life settings and from experiments in the lab. Fortunately, listening to music, the most common form of distraction, does not appear to affect pedestrian behavior. What about texting or talking on the phone? Most studies find no difference in the propensity to stay within the crosswalk or cross with the light when distracted. In fact, at least one study found people talking or texting were actually more likely to cross with the light. What about looking both ways? The evidence is mixed, and studies use an extremely stringent definition of looking both ways that few people follow, even those who aren't distracted. What about recognizing gaps in traffic? The experimental results are, once again, mixed. Some say yes, some say no. And notice that people may be compensating for their distraction, looking for extra wide gaps to make sure that they'll make it across safely. And this approach appears to work fairly well. Finally, what about crossing more slowly? This is of interest because pedestrians are exposed to more risk the longer they are in a crosswalk. Data comes from both observations and experiments. While the studies I've reviewed suggest that pedestrians do cross more slowly, they are not crawling across the street. The delay associated with talking on the phone was akin to being middle-aged, and texting was akin to being over 65. So distraction does seem to slow people down, but it's well within normal walking speeds. Let's move on to the most important question. Is distraction unsafe? At the time I conducted this research, there was just one observational study on safety while distracted, and it was the most cited paper on distracted walking. The headline finding is shocking. 48% of people on a phone crossed unsafely. But this is an extremely small sample. The authors observed only 25 people on a phone, and only 11 of them had a car approaching. What about laboratory experiments? They can tell us how often participants in a virtual reality setting got hit or nearly hit. But once again, the results are mixed. Some experiments found more, some did not. The key difference is whether participants could adjust their speed as they crossed the street. In experiments where they could adjust, there was no difference in the tendency to get hit or experience close calls. Crash statistics aren't much help for evaluating safety because most data sets do not measure distraction consistently, and this includes the Fatality Analysis Reporting System, or FARS. Therefore, we have to turn to other data. One estimate comes from a nationwide study of emergency room records on cause of injury. Of people who were injured while walking, fewer than 4% of them were using a phone. Another upper limit estimate comes from New York City, where pedestrian error or confusion was a factor in 21.5% of the fatal or serious injury crashes involving a pedestrian. Now, this is likely a significant overestimate because it includes many behaviors beyond distraction. Beyond distraction, there are many other plausible explanations for the rise in pedestrian deaths. We would expect more crashes just because there are more people and more driving, which increased by 6.9% and 8.1% respectively. This is clearly not the whole story because pedestrian deaths per million miles driven increased 30%, and deaths per million people increased 28%. What else could it be? The number of SUVs increased 37% between 2009 and 2016, and pedestrians are far more likely to die when hit by an SUV than a standard car. Distracted driving also remains widespread, and it is incredibly risky. Americans are also moving to riskier locations. The 10 fastest growing states had 40% more pedestrian fatalities per person and 79% higher values on the Pedestrian Danger Index than the remaining 40 states. Finally, I want to emphasize that a year before the smartphone, over 60,000 pedestrians were injured and 4,700 were killed in car crashes. They were not distracted by cell phones. The roadway conditions that led to their injuries and deaths persist to this day. Thus far, we have seen that the evidence base for the harms of distracted walking is rather weak. Despite this, many transportation practitioners worry about distracted walking. I surveyed transportation practitioners at conferences, and fully a third of them believe that distracted walking is a large problem, responsible for about 40% of pedestrian deaths. Within this group, some practitioners made very high estimates indeed. About 1 in 6 estimated that over half of all pedestrian deaths were due to distracted walking, and 1 in 10 believed that at least 75% of deaths were due to distraction. My point here is that for some practitioners, the idea of distracted walking has really taken hold. Now that we've seen that many practitioners worry about distracted walking, let's explore why this is a problem. Broadly speaking, how we frame problems shapes how we go about solving them. We can see evidence of this from the survey where I asked respondents about their preferred way to improve pedestrian safety. Our baseline here is people who believe distraction is not a problem. Relative to them, people who believe distraction is a problem are more likely to prefer education, especially for pedestrians. And in turn, they are less likely to support lowering speed limits or reducing speeds via changes to roadway design. To be clear, these are multivariate results, so they account for driving mode, professional training, age, and sex. These results are a problem because we know that individual-level solutions like education are less effective at improving safety than systems-level solutions like lowering speeds. Another problem is that the distracted walking frame detracts from bigger issues. Recall that distraction was responsible for 4% of pedestrian injuries nationwide. By comparison, speeding was responsible for 26% of fatal crashes. Intoxication is responsible for 47% of fatal crashes, and driver inattention is responsible for 57% of serious pedestrian crashes, but that's just in New York City. The distracted walking frame also narrows the call to action. The changes required to save lives are superficial, not foundational. The underlying systems can remain intact, absolving practitioners from the need to rethink values, priorities, and funding structures. The distracted walking frame is also inconsistent with Vision Zero, which is based on the premise that streets should be safe for all users. Remember that we saw that people who walk distracted may walk more slowly. They may fail to identify safe gaps in traffic, and they may look left and right less often. But we also know that elderly people take longer to cross, that children struggle to identify suitable crossing opportunities, and that looking left and right does not help blind people all that much. So, if our approach to improving safety is to chastise distracted pedestrians, we should be comfortable with the corollary, that streets will remain unsafe for the elderly, for children, and the blind. Finally, the distracted walking frame increases policing, which is punitive and places a disproportionate burden on Black and Hispanic communities. So, worrying about distracted walking is harmful. There is weak evidence that it is particularly risky, yet many practitioners worry about it. Why is it so tempting to worry? 3 cognitive biases can help explain the popularity of this idea. First, thanks to the availability bias, we know that ideas are easier to recall when we have many vivid examples of them. Second, if we think that something is a problem, we will see more of it due to confirmation bias. Finally, ideas seem true when we hear about them again and again due to the illusory truth effect. This last one is really powerful because distracted walking is incredibly newsworthy. Here is just a small sampling of headlines from the major national press about distracted walking. A final issue is that focusing on distracted walking is convenient and strategic. The automotive industry has an incentive to promote distracted walking because focusing on the behaviors of pesky pedestrians helps absolve the industry of responsibility, much like the invention of jaywalking in the 1920s. Transportation practitioners may embrace distracted walking as the path of least resistance. Reducing speeds, increasing enforcement, or changing street design all face considerable political hurdles and are time-consuming and costly. By contrast, educational materials are inexpensive, straightforward, and far less controversial. In this way, educational campaigns are often the path of least resistance. Let me leave you with some parting advice. First, avoid false equivalences. While pedestrians may occasionally run into a pole or step into traffic, their actions primarily endanger themselves. By contrast, distracted drivers primarily imperil those around them and should face a greater responsibility for road safety. Second, avoid the natural tendency to focus on individuals. Let me illustrate with data from Edmonton, Canada, where drivers hit 284 pedestrians in 2017, killing 9 of them. The temptation is to dissect the actions of the people who were hit. But if we zoom out, we see that Edmonton drivers hit over 49,000 objects that year, including 5,500 stationary objects, like parked cars and signs. Zooming out reveals a broader pattern. Educating pedestrians won't solve this problem. Finally, question the usefulness of seemingly funny campaigns against distracted walking. They may seem harmless, but they normalize the idea that pedestrians are to blame for their deaths. To recap, the evidence base for distracted walking is fairly weak. Nevertheless, many practitioners are worried about it. This is a problem because focusing on distraction leads us to pursue ineffective solutions, detracts from more serious issues, and is inconsistent with Vision Zero. It is natural to be tempted to worry, but practitioners should zoom out and focus on large, systematic traffic safety problems. Thank you for listening. To learn more, you can download the full published paper for free via open access.